Several times a day, people across the globe glance at their phones, watches, and good old-fashioned wall clocks to get the time. If you stop and think about it, many of the tasks we do are dictated by this mode of measurement, whether it's a work meeting at 10, lunch at noon, or a workout class at 6. Time is a constant reminder of each fleeting moment passing by. But before modern technology, how did early people tell time? Well, there have been many different methods across centuries and civilizations, but one of the easiest ways to get an estimate is to simply look up at the sky.
The oldest way of measuring time is a highly local thing, right? You're looking at what is the position of the sun in the sky. And of course, now we know that the sun appears to move through the sky because the earth is rotating. That means that it's different times at different places on the surface of the earth. So depending on exactly where you're standing, the sun will be seen in a different position in the sky, and thus it'll appear to be a different time. So, right from the earliest days, there's this issue of time being something that's essentially local and particular to a given location.
That's Chad Orzel, an associate professor of physics and astronomy at Union College in New York, and the author of A Brief History of Timekeeping, the science of marking time from Stonehenge to atomic clocks. Orzel says that today we've synchronized clocks around the world through the use of time zones, like Eastern, Central, and so on. But rewind back to earlier civilizations, and measuring time was a purely local calculation using inventions that looked at a larger scale.
The very earliest kinds of clocks that exist are essentially solstice markers, or the earliest surviving clocks. The things that we can still see in operation today are solstice markers. So they're basically enormous constructions that have some alignment to the position of the rising or setting sun.
But these massive structures don't tell exact time. In past civilizations, they were mainly used to ring in the changing of the seasons. Orzel highlights one unique site called New Grange that's right outside of Dublin in Ireland.
It's a giant artificial hill made of about 100,000 metric tons of stone and dirt that's heaped up. And there's a passage going into the center of this artificial hill. And once a year, around the winter solstice, so around December 21st, the rising sun is aligned in just the right position so that it casts a beam of light down this 20-meter long passage into the central chamber of this hill. And that's the only time all year that that central chamber gets lit up. This is something that works as a clock that tells you once a year, okay, we are now at the winter solstice. And that's an incredibly important piece of information for an agrarian society, right? That tells you today is the shortest day of the year. This is as bad as it's going to get. From here on out, the days are going to get longer. It's going to start getting warmer. It's time to prepare for spring.
These ancient designs mark the beginnings of modern timekeeping. Each is an important piece of history that still fascinates millions to this day. Take the global appeal of Stonehenge, for instance. According to archaeologists, this was yet another structure where people of the past came together and celebrated the winter solstice.
This is a collection of stones, the giant sort of letter pi-shaped trilithons in Stonehenge that are set up so that if you're standing in the right position, you see, the setting sun framed by these on one day of the year. And that tells you where you are in the calendar. That's okay, now I know it's the winter solstice. And this is incredibly significant if you're an agrarian society. So these are the oldest and most spectacular kinds of monuments. Stonehenge is particularly interesting because it's this huge open thing. It's out in the middle of a field. And so you can see it from a wide range of distances. And you can imagine, gatherings of hundreds, thousands of people coming together there to see these particular events that are highlighted by that.
If you travel outside of Europe, you'll find a more precise method of keeping time called water clocks. These ingenious designs were seen in early Egypt and China, and could be used to measure a specified amount of time.
The core idea of a water clock is you just take a container full of water and you put a hole in the bottom and let the water drip out, right? And then you measure time by, how long does it take the water to drip out? If you can have an outflow type water clock, that's a container that starts out full and you mark the level as it drops. And that tells you how much time has elapsed.
This basic concept eventually led to the build-out of a more complex and accurate structure that was engineered in China during the 12th century by a man named Su Song. It stood around 40 feet high and more closely resembled the type of clock towers we know today. Orzel says the main framework was made up of a massive wheel with buckets on the ends that would get filled by water flowing at a constant rate.
So the bucket at one end of the wheel is under this water source. It fills up. When the bucket gets full, it tips and it triggers a release mechanism that lets the wheel rotate by a small amount, moves that bucket out of the way, brings an empty one in, and then the locking mechanism kicks back in. That bucket fills. Right when it's full, it tips, lets the wheel rotate one more bucket worth, and so on. And so it's this massive clock that's powered by flowing water and regulated by the flow of the water. So it turns, one bucket's worth every couple of minutes. And that was used to drive a giant public clock display. They had placards showing what time it was. They had drums and bells and things that would sound the hours, right? All of this powered by this constant flow of water. So it's a really ingenious thing that's kind of between a classic water clock that's just a container filling up with water and a modern mechanical clock, which is something where you have gears that are turning, driven by some force.
Yet mechanical clocks were, in fact, not invented until a couple hundred years later. For centuries, water clock towers were the predominant way to measure time. But fast forward to today, and it would be hard to stumble upon a working water clock. Instead, atomic clocks are the go-to in the modern era. This technology relies on the resonance frequencies of atoms to get the most accurate timing science has to offer.
We can build atomic clocks that are incredibly precise and verify that. They've done this at Gila in Boulder. They built these atomic clocks that are based on aluminum ions.
These precise clocks are vital for more than just everyday use. For example, today's modern GPS system relies on a large network of atomic clocks inside satellites that orbit the Earth and broadcast the precise time. But how does time play into finding a location? Orzel says one way to think about location is in terms of how long it would take you to get from where you are to someplace else. For instance, someone residing in a suburb could describe where they live as being 30 minutes outside of a nearby city. If they told you a second town and how far that one was from their house, you could combine the information to get a better idea of where they live.
What we do with GPS is essentially the same. You take the signal from several clocks and compare them, and that tells you how long the light waves carrying the signal with the time took to get to you from each satellite. And if you know how long the light took to get to you from the satellite, you know how far away you are from the satellite. That gets you a distance. You're somewhere on a sphere centered on that satellite. And if you have 3 of these or 4 of these, you can find a single point on the surface of the Earth where those spheres intersect and say, that's my location. So the fact that we know the orbits of these satellites extremely well, and we know the distance from your position to the satellite, that enables you to take 3 of those distances and turn it into a location on the surface of the Earth, which works incredibly well. And this requires timing of, you have to have time signals for this process that are accurate to within a few nanoseconds, right? Light travels about 1 foot per nanosecond. So you need clocks that are good to nanosecond precision, which means you need atomic clocks.
Timekeeping is a complicated topic, but it's also a constant measurement that every human on Earth relies on. To find out more about all things time and our guest, Chad Orzel, visit viewpointsradio.org. You can also check out his new book, A Brief History of Timekeeping, now available online and in bookstores. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri, studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
There are many times that I resolved to stop. There are many times that I said I would change or even get help, but then reversed myself.
The all-consuming grasp of addiction. Then,
a lot of the United States is very auto-oriented. So this is an area that our nation really needs to focus on if we want to get people out of those cars and into healthy, active forms of mobility.
Exploring different modes of mobility. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.